Have you ever wondered how one man, armed only with faith and courage, could stand against the most powerful empire of his time? How did Moses, once a fugitive, defy Pharaoh, lead a nation out of slavery, and witness some of the most extraordinary miracles in history? In this video, we'll uncover the incredible story of Moses, a leader chosen by God to confront oppression, challenge injustice, and deliver his people to freedom. This isn't just an ancient tale, it's a journey filled with lessons for your own life. You'll discover how Moses' unwavering faith can inspire you to overcome challenges, trust in God's plan, and lead with purpose. Whether you're seeking spiritual growth, a deeper understanding of biblical history, or practical lessons for today, this video has something to strengthen your faith and transform your perspective. Before we dive in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple way to help spread God's word and reach others who need this message of hope and courage. Let's get started. During the time of Moses, Israel was living in severe oppression in Egypt. The Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians, forced to work under harsh conditions for the Pharaoh. They built cities and worked in the fields, facing constant cruelty and hardship. The Pharaoh feared the growing number of Israelites and, in an effort to control them, imposed even harsher labor and oppression. Life for the Israelites was marked by suffering, as they cried out to God for deliverance, knowing they were trapped in a land of slavery with no way to escape. Moses was born during a particularly difficult time for the Israelites. Pharaoh had issued an order to kill all male Hebrew infants in an attempt to control the population. When Moses was born, his mother, Jochebed, hid him for 3 months to protect him from the Pharaoh's decree. Eventually, unable to keep him hidden any longer, she placed him in a basket and set him afloat in the Nile River. By God's providence, Moses was found by Pharaoh's daughter, who took pity on him and decided to raise him as her own, allowing him to grow up in the palace, away from the harsh conditions faced by his people. Moses' early life in the palace was privileged, but God had a greater purpose for him. As an adult, Moses became aware of the suffering of the Israelites and his own Hebrew heritage. One day, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and in anger, Moses killed the Egyptian. Fearing for his life, Moses fled to the land of Midian, where he lived for many years as a shepherd. During this time, God called Moses in a dramatic way. While Moses was tending his sheep on Mount Horeb, he saw a bush that was burning but not consumed. When Moses approached, God spoke to him from the bush, calling him to return to Egypt and lead the Israelites out of slavery. At first, Moses hesitated at God's call. He questioned his ability to fulfill such a monumental task and felt unworthy of the responsibility. Moses argued that he was not an eloquent speaker and that the people would not believe him. Despite his doubts and reluctance, God reassured Moses, promising to be with him and giving him the power to perform signs and wonders to prove his authority. God even provided Moses with his brother Aaron to assist him in speaking to the people and Pharaoh. Though Moses initially resisted, he eventually accepted God's mission and returned to Egypt, ready to confront Pharaoh and lead the Israelites to freedom. Moses' call was not just a personal journey, but a pivotal moment in the history of Israel. God's plan for Moses was to deliver his people from centuries of oppression, showing that no matter how impossible the task may seem, God equips those he calls. Moses was chosen to be the instrument of God's power and deliverance. His hesitations and doubts were overcome by his obedience to God, and through him, God's promise to Israel would begin to be fulfilled. This story teaches us that even when we feel inadequate or afraid, God is the one who empowers us to do the work he calls us to. Like Moses, we may question our abilities, but God always provides what we need to fulfill his purposes. Moses' journey from a hesitant man in the desert to a powerful leader is a testament to the power of God's calling and the importance of trusting in his plan, no matter how daunting it may seem. Moses, accompanied by his brother Aaron, approached Pharaoh with a simple but powerful message from God: "Let my people go." The Israelites had been slaves in Egypt for generations, and God had chosen Moses to lead them to freedom. However, Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he refused to listen to Moses. Each time Moses requested the release of the Israelites, Pharaoh became more stubborn, refusing to acknowledge the power of the God of Israel. This resistance led to a series of confrontations between Moses and Pharaoh, which ultimately resulted in a divine display of God's power through a series of plagues. To convince Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, God sent 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt. The first plague turned the waters of the Nile into blood, causing fish to die and the river to become undrinkable. Following this, Egypt was struck by a series of increasingly severe plagues, including frogs, gnats, flies, and a deadly disease that killed livestock. The plagues continued, each one showing the Pharaoh that his refusal to obey God would have disastrous consequences. With each plague, Pharaoh's resistance grew, but God's power became more evident as he demonstrated his authority over the natural world and the Egyptian gods. The plagues reached their climax with the final and most devastating one, the death of the firstborn sons of Egypt. God instructed the Israelites to mark their doorposts with the blood of a lamb, and when the angel of death passed over, it would spare the homes marked with blood. This became known as the Passover. Tragically, the firstborn sons of Egypt died, including Pharaoh's own son. This final blow broke Pharaoh's resolve, and he finally relented, allowing the Israelites to leave. However, even after this devastating loss, Pharaoh's heart would still be hardened, leading to further consequences. The 10 plagues demonstrated God's power and judgment on Egypt, showing that no one, not even the mighty Pharaoh, could stand against the will of God. Each plague was not just a punishment but also a challenge to the Egyptian gods, proving that the God of Israel was superior. These plagues also served to build the faith of the Israelites, showing them that God was fighting for them and would lead them to freedom. It was a turning point in the history of Israel, as they realized that their deliverance would come not through their own strength but through the mighty hand of God. After the final plague, the Israelites began to prepare for their departure from Egypt. Moses led them out of the land of their captivity, but Pharaoh, once again, changed his mind and pursued them with his army. The Israelites faced a terrifying obstacle. The Red Sea stood before them, and the Egyptian army was closing in behind. In this moment of desperation, God instructed Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea. Miraculously, the waters parted, and the Israelites crossed on dry land, escaping the Egyptians. The crossing of the Red Sea was not just a miraculous event, it marked the beginning of the Israelites' journey to freedom. It was a moment of divine intervention that displayed God's power and his faithfulness to his people. Even when it seemed like there was no way forward, God made a path for his people. As the Egyptians tried to follow, the waters closed in on them, and the entire army was drowned. The Israelites were finally free, and they celebrated their miraculous deliverance. This moment would go down in history as one of the greatest demonstrations of God's power and faithfulness. The crossing of the Red Sea was one of the most dramatic and miraculous moments in the history of Israel. After being freed from slavery in Egypt, the Israelites were making their way toward the Promised Land. However, they found themselves trapped between the Red Sea and the pursuing Egyptian army. Fear and panic gripped the people, as they thought they had nowhere to go. In this moment of desperation, God spoke to Moses and instructed him to raise his staff over the sea. As Moses obeyed, the waters of the Red Sea miraculously parted, creating a dry path for the Israelites to walk through. This incredible act of divine intervention allowed the Israelites to escape the Egyptians and continue their journey. As the Israelites made their way across the sea, the Egyptian army, determined to recapture them, followed closely behind. But God had a plan to ensure the safety of his people. When the last of the Israelites had safely crossed, God told Moses to stretch out his staff again. As he did so, the waters of the Red Sea returned to their normal state, drowning the Egyptian soldiers and their chariots. The entire army of Pharaoh was destroyed, and Israel was completely freed from their oppression. This dramatic moment marked a clear and decisive victory for Israel, proving that God was with them and had the power to protect and deliver them. The destruction of the Egyptian army by the returning waters of the Red Sea was not just a victory in a military sense, it was a clear demonstration of God's power and his commitment to his people. This event showed that no enemy, no matter how mighty, could stand against the will of God. The Egyptians, who had been oppressing Israel for centuries, were now completely defeated. For the Israelites, this victory was a confirmation that God had truly heard their cries for help and that He was leading them to freedom. It solidified their trust in Moses as their divinely appointed leader and leader of God's people. The victory at the Red Sea had a profound effect on the Israelites' faith. Before this moment, the people had witnessed God's miracles through the plagues, but crossing the Red Sea was different. It was a personal experience for each individual, walking through a sea that had been parted by God's power. It was a life-changing event that brought them closer to God and strengthened their belief that He was with them. Their trust in God grew stronger as they realized that He was capable of performing miracles and would guide them to safety. Moses' leadership was also solidified through this miraculous event. Before the crossing of the Red Sea, the people were uncertain and fearful. However, after witnessing God's mighty power and Moses' obedience, they recognized him as their leader, chosen by God. Moses had faithfully led them out of Egypt, and now, through God's intervention, He had led them safely through the Red Sea. This victory was a turning point for Moses' leadership and for the Israelites as a whole. They now knew, without a doubt, that God had chosen Moses to guide them. The crossing of the Red Sea remains a powerful symbol of faith and deliverance. For Israel, it was a turning point in their journey toward freedom. It marked the moment when they were no longer slaves in Egypt, but a people chosen by God to fulfill a great purpose. For Christians today, this event serves as a reminder of God's faithfulness, power, and ability to deliver His people. Even when faced with seemingly impossible situations, God is able to make a way where there seems to be no way. Through the Red Sea, Israel learned to trust in God's plan, and it is a lesson that continues to inspire believers today. Moses' story is a powerful reminder of the importance of having unshakable faith in God, even when facing seemingly impossible challenges. From the moment God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, Moses encountered obstacle after obstacle, whether it was the refusal of Pharaoh to let his people go or the overwhelming task of leading a group of people through the wilderness. Yet, despite the difficulties, Moses trusted that God would fulfill His promises. He demonstrated that true faith is not the absence of challenges but the trust that God will provide a way through them. His life teaches us that when we place our faith in God, He will help us achieve great things, even when it seems impossible. Moses also exemplifies servant leadership. Although he was a powerful leader chosen by God to free the Israelites, he never saw himself as above the people he was leading. Instead, he consistently put the needs of his people first. Even when the Israelites grumbled and complained, Moses interceded on their behalf before God, pleading for their forgiveness. He didn't act out of selfish ambition but out of a deep desire to serve God and His people. Moses shows us that leadership is not about power or control but about serving others with humility and compassion. A true leader is one who sacrifices for the good of those they lead. Moses' leadership was also defined by his unwavering obedience to God's commands. At times, Moses did not fully understand the purpose behind God's instructions, yet he followed them without question. One of the most powerful moments in his leadership was when he stretched his staff over the Red Sea at God's command, even though it seemed like an impossible solution to the Israelites' predicament. But Moses trusted that God's plan was greater than his understanding. His obedience allowed God to perform miracles, including the parting of the Red Sea, which led to the Israelites' escape from Egypt. This teaches us that obedience is crucial, even when we do not fully grasp the reasons behind God's direction. By obeying God, we align ourselves with His will and become part of His greater plan. Moses' role as an intercessor is another important aspect of his leadership. Time and time again, he interceded on behalf of the Israelites, pleading with God to forgive them when they sinned. For example, after the people made the golden calf, Moses went up the mountain to plead with God to spare them. His actions show us that leadership is not about just giving orders but also about being an advocate for others. It requires standing in the gap and seeking God's mercy on behalf of those we lead. Through his intercession, Moses demonstrated the power of prayer and how one person's faith can impact a whole nation. The lessons Moses teaches us about leadership also apply to how we should approach our own lives. In the face of trials, we are called to trust God fully, obey His commands, and lead by serving others. Whether in a position of authority or not, each of us is called to be a leader in our homes, workplaces, and communities. Moses shows us that real leadership doesn't come from being in charge, but from being willing to serve, act with integrity, and trust in God's plan, even when it's not immediately clear. Lastly, Moses' life encourages us to remember that faith, humility, and obedience are key to fulfilling God's purpose in our lives. By following the example of Moses, we can be effective leaders who make a lasting impact on the world around us. Through his journey, Moses demonstrated that no matter how challenging the task, God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. When we rely on God's guidance and lead with a servant's heart, we can accomplish His will and make a difference in the lives of those we serve. In conclusion, Moses' life is a powerful testament to God's faithfulness and the importance of obedience, faith, and leadership. From his divine calling at the burning bush to his mission of liberating the Israelites from slavery, Moses' journey was filled with challenges and miracles. He faced Pharaoh's resistance, witnessed God's power through the 10 plagues, and led the Israelites to freedom by parting the Red Sea. Through his leadership, Moses not only delivered a nation but also set an example of trusting in God's plan, even when the path seemed uncertain. Moses' leadership was marked by his unshakable faith in God, even when faced with the seemingly impossible. His story teaches us that, in our own lives, we too must trust in God's plan, especially in times of adversity. Just as Moses relied on God to fulfill the task before him, we can trust that God will guide us in fulfilling our purpose. Like Moses, we may face moments where the journey seems difficult, but we must remember that God is always with us, providing the strength we need. As we reflect on Moses' journey, we are encouraged to think about our own lives and leadership. How can we lead with the same humility, obedience, and faith that Moses displayed? What steps can we take to trust God more fully in our own challenges and remain committed to His purpose for our lives? Moses shows us that true leadership comes from serving others, seeking God's guidance, and having the courage to take action even when the outcome is uncertain. Moses' life challenges us to reflect on the role of faith in our own leadership. Whether in our families, workplaces, or communities, we are all called to be leaders in some capacity. And just as Moses trusted God to lead Israel, we must trust God to lead us. When we face obstacles, God is our strength, and His plan for us will unfold as we walk in faith and obedience, just as Moses did. God's presence in Moses' life is the same presence that is available to us today. The story of Moses reminds us that God's victory often comes when we are still and trust in His power. When the Israelites were at the edge of the Red Sea, Moses reminded them that God would fight for them. They only needed to be still and trust. In moments of struggle, we can take comfort in knowing that we don't have to fight our battles alone. God goes before us, guiding us toward victory. To end, let us remember the powerful words from Exodus 14 verse 14, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." This is a reminder that, when we trust in God, He goes before us, fighting our battles and leading us to victory. As we face our own challenges, let us hold on to the faith that God will guide us, just as He guided Moses, to accomplish His purposes for our lives.